We finished more or less the Hakdama to Masechta Menachos, and now we're going to take a look at the Mesiftas Hakdama to Masechta Zvachim, and we'll try it. It'll be an experiment. So the first section here is dividing up the various categories of karbanos. So we can talk about a karban ola, and we can break that down into a second category called a neder or a nedava or a chova. We can talk about a karban ola that's incumbent upon the tzibur, upon the yachid. Then we can go on to a karban chatas. And with regard to chatas, we can divide that up into what's called chatas chitzona, chatas pnimis, chatas yachid, chatas tzibur. And we can even talk about chatas ha'of. Actually in both ola and in chatas. Then we move on to a karban asham. And a karban asham is by definition a karban chova, as we'll see. And finally we get to a karban shlomim. And a karban shlomim could be a karban yachid. It could be a karban tzibur in the very rare cases. And it might include things like a neder, it might include a karban toda, it might include karmaiser and pesach, all these cases. Now, after we finish the division, the subdivision of the four categories of zera, then we go on to dividing up the various animals and birds. But we're not going to talk about menachos because that we did it. So first, number one is ola. Now, he introduces the fact that an ola is kodshim, but the truth is that 3 out of 4 of the categories are kodshim. That's ola, chatas, and osh. The only exception to the rule is shlomim. Shlomim is kodshim kal. Now, what does it mean? What's unique about an ola? Okay, ola like chatas and osham is kodshim. But there's something very unique about the ola, and that is that there's no achilas adam in the case of an ola. Every carbon, with the exception of a carbon ola, divides up into 2 achilos. There's achilas mizbeach, which is the haktorah, and there's achilas adam, which is eaten either by zukrei kahuna, as we'll see, or by bailim, even not kohanim in the case of shalom. But in the case of ola, it's kulo kolit. Everything goes up on the fire. It's all haktorah. And that's really the deeper meaning of the word ola. Ola means ola al gabi mizbech, ola al gabi ha'esh. Okay. Now, carbon ola, in a sense, is like the most broad or flexible carbon of them all, because it applies both the neder and the double. We'll see in a minute the difference between the two. It applies to carbon chova. It applies to yachid, it applies to tzibur, it applies to behema, and it applies to oaf. And very often it requires nisachim, the accompaniment of nisachim that we discussed. That's in the case of a behema. But be that as it may, you see the scope of a carbon ola is very, very broad. So now let's talk about neder and nidava. If a person says harei alai ola, that means he did not designate a specific animal and say harei zu ola. He just said harei alai ola. Then he has what's called a neder. The neder is chal on him, and it obligates him to designate at some point an animal of chulin as a carbon ola. So that's called a neder, harei alai ola. Then we get to something called a nedava. And a nedava means that he points to a specific animal and he says, harei zu ola. And in such a case, then if that Ola, which he designated as an Adava, got lost, then he's not obligated to replace it. Meaning his commitment was only to this animal. He doesn't have to replace it because that animal is gone. That's not the case in a nether. When he says Arei Ola, then he has what's called a chiyuv achrayus. And that means that if this particular carbon, this particular behemoth that he designates gets lost or dies, it becomes tummy, whatever happens to it, then he has not fulfilled his neder of Harei Olai. He's got to find another animal and replace the first one. Now he adds something here. He says, "Hu meratza lo al averas esei shebiyado." He's asking the following question: what is the ritzu? What is the purpose, the goal of a neder or an adav? In both cases, it's voluntary, and he accepted it upon himself. We're not talking about an olas chova. And the answer is that it's a ritzui on averos esen. He was not careful about fulfilling a mitzvah's essay, and the ola is going to bring him ritzui and kapara for the non-fulfillment of an essay. So again, if I were to test you and ask you, you have the following multiple choice, either neder or nadav. And I would say to you that the carbon that he designated died. Does he have to replace it? And if I say to you, yes, he has to replace it, what am I talking about? A neder or a nadav? A nadav, again. A neder means harei alai. So I have to replace it. Well, what did I ask? Oh, that's what I asked. Oh, do I have to replace it? Yes, I have to replace it in a case of a neder. Now we get to a mitzorah. And now we're shifting from a voluntary carbon ola to an obligatory carbon ola. So mitzorah, as part of the process of his tara, on the 8th day, let's say on the 7th day, he goes to the mikvah. And on the 8th day, he has to bring a carbon ola. Here he writes, Tovel b'yom hashmini. Okay, that has to be taken under advisement. I don't know. Now, is there a possibility that the tzibur itself will take upon itself a nedav? I would have said that's impossible. But under what circumstances would there be a carbon ola that's a nedav of the tzibur? Right, the classic carbon ola is the carbon tamid, which is brought twice a day, and that's a chovas tzibur. Can you have a nidvas tzibur? He says yes. Nisnadvu rov hatzibur lavi ola. We get together most of the tzibur, and we all agree that we will bring a carbon ola. And then we're going to collect money, which is called a machzis hashekel, from most of the tzibur that accepted upon themselves to bring an ola. And this is called an olas tzibur haba'a b'nedav. And that's the Ramban in his commentary at the very beginning of Vayikra. Now we have another shita. Yesha omrim shenedavas tzibur hi ha'ola ba l'keitz hamizbeach. So that means that a person will volunteer to contribute to the mizbeach when the mizbeach is idle, just to be makriv of a carbon ola on the mizbeach. But now we're saying that the tzibur could take upon itself an adava under the law of Keitz HaMizbeach. For who? Shahaya HaMizbeach Batal Mikarbonos, Mevim Mimosar Trumas Alishka. There is a surplus in the collection of the Trumas Alishka, Karbonos Olas Behema. So we have two factors, by two conditions. Number one, right now the Mizbeach is Batal, and number two, we have Mosar Truma Shel Lishka. The Lishka is overflowing with money. We're going to take that overflow money and we're going to earmark it for Olas Hatzibur. But what kind of Olas Hatzibur? A Nidava. Because the tzibur was never obligated. It just happens to be that we have a surplus of true money in the Trumas Lishka, and the Mizbeach is sitting there lying fallow, lying idly, and the combination thereof is going to give us an Olas Nidvas Hatzibur. V'nikra kates, miloshen kinuach seuda. So the word kates means like a dessert. So maybe b'kinuach seuda minima metika shekar ama kosov kates. What's the source in Tanakh for the word kates, referring to mesika? A dessert, a sweet dessert. Shenemar ve'alechem ve'hakaitz lechol haneor. So lechem, I guess, is the mainstay of the meal, and the kites is the after meal, the dessert. So that's the etymology or the source of the word kates. Reminds me of the mission at the end of Pesachim, Ein maftir nachar Pesach afikoma. It's like an afikoma, and it comes at the end of the meal. Now, is there such a thing as a carbon ola, which is a chovas atzibur? We spoke about a mitzora, but that's a chovas yachid. And the answer is that chovas tzibur is your classic example of a carbon, meaning the carbon ola that's brought twice a day. That's a tummy. And that is a chovas tzibur. By the way, as a note, that's why we require mamodos, because a carbon always requires that the bialim should stand over the carbon, but we can't bring the entire tzibur of Klal Yisrael, so we appoint agents. They will represent us. Those are the mamodos. And then what did I do with my tea? I had a tea here, but I not. Oh, you need a thermos. Now, we said that an ola is very, I don't want to use the word flexible, but a different word. What do you call it? Like a jack of all trades, somebody who has a lot of talents, there's a word for that in English. Anyway, so we have number one, both neder, midava, we have both yachid and tzibur. And now we can have a nidvas tzibur and a chovas tzibur. But that's all behemoths. Now we get to oath. So we have an olas ha'of. And classically, an olas ha'of is ba b'nidava, with neder and nidava. But he says you can have an olas ha'of b'chov. So let's just figure out, when do you have an olas ha'of b'chov? He quotes the case of a Zav who saw 3 re'iyos, and after he goes to mikvah, he brings an oath as an olah on the 8th day of his Tara. That's the case of a Zav. Now, what's the case of an olas, neder, or nedav? A man comes forward and he declares, Harei alai kan li olah. I'm going to bring 2 birds as an olah. He brings either 2 torim or shnei b'nei yonah. He should not bring a tar and a ben yonah. He doesn't combine the 2 meat. he could take a different kind of an neder. Instead of saying kan liola, which is a pair of identical species, he could say, I want to bring as a nedava a ben yona and a tar. That's fine. So this is a korban ola from an oath, and it's nedava. So that's the first round here of 4, and that's the korban ola. Now we get to chatos. Chatos, again, like ola is kodesh kadoshim. But in chatos, we're going to soon see that in most cases, not in all cases, there is achilas kohanim. That's called a chatos kitzono. So we separate between 2 parts of the chatos. One part of the chatos is called the emurim, and that has to be burnt on the mizbeach. And then the balance, which is not the emurim but the basar, that's eaten by kohen. Now we have another concept called chatos pnimis. I'm not sure if he gives you the list here. No, I don't think he gives you the list. But a chatos pnimis means that the emurim are burnt, but the basar is also burnt. Chutz liyushalayim. That's called chatos pnimis. So far we have a chatos chitzona, and we have a chatos pnimis. Now we have a chatos ha'of. And a chatos ha'of is the mizbeach only gets hazos hadamim, but the entire, there's not that much meat in an oaf, but the meat is eaten by the kohen. Now, a chatos by definition is a korban chova, not like a korban ola, which can be brought in either in dava. And the purpose, and you can say that this exhausts the purpose of chatos, is kapara sachet. Now he says that you can have a chatos of a yochid and a chatos of a tzibur. And both are chova, because as we said before, chatos by definition always is a chova. A chatos is flexible. You could have a chatos behema, you could chatos ha'of. It does not require nisachim except for the one case of chatos mitzorah. In echlekes l'shnei sugim, chatos nitzona, chatos pnimis. What's the difference? So again, in the case of azor, the azor, in the case of chatos nitzona, is on the mizbeach hachitzon. In the case of a chatos pnimis, the azor is on the mizbeach hapnimim. Hence the terminology, the name chatos pnimis. And where is the azor achieved? In neged haparoches shebehecha. Yesh min hachatos hapnimis shemazim midom b'kodesh kadoshim ba'avir shebein badei hashulchan. And those are the chatos hapnimios of Yom Kippur. Because there's no other day in the Hebrew calendar besides Yom Kippur where you're allowed to enter into the Kodesh Kadoshim. Now there's another name for chatos pnimis, and that's called chatos hanisrafos. And the reason why the name nisrafos is appropriate because we take all the basar, except for the emurim, and we bring them chutz l'Yerushalayim, and that's where we burn them. Hence the title chatos hanisrafos. Chatos chitzona ba b'chovas hayochid. And that's a classic case of someone who violated an Isur Kares B'Shogeg. He brings a behema lechatos and he says, Areisu chatos. When is the tzibur obligated in a korban? Chatos, that's on the 3 regolim on Rosh Chodesh before the Korban Musaf is brought, and that's called Sa'ir Lechatos. Chatos Pnimis is a Chovas Yochid. How is that possible? Because again, if you're talking about Yom Kippur, you're talking about a Chovas Tzibur. However, there's something called a Kohen Mashuach, and he gave a Horah to violate, again, mistakenly, to violate an Isur, which would generate a Chiyuv Chatos B'Shogeg. And he himself, based on the ruling that he brought that he gave down, that he submitted, he himself violated an Isur Shogeg, an Isur Kares. Is maybe Par Kohen Mashiach. And that's again the whole year round. Now I don't know why he doesn't bring Par Helim Dovashal Tzibur. Did I miss that? Chovas Hatzibur. Here it is. Because until now he's talking about a Yochid. Okay, fine. In a Tzibur, you could have a Chatas Pnimis if the Sanhedrin handed down a mistaken verdict and it implies that the people violated a Los Aseh. And what kind of a Los Aseh? It's a Los Aseh that if he had violated B'Shogeg, he'd be Chayv Chatas Nitzon. All Shevet Yisrael maybe Karban Lechatasa. He Nikreis Par Helim Dovashal Tzibur. So in the case of a Chovas Tzibur of a Chatas, we can have as many as 12 Chiyuvei Chatas in one shot. And that's called Shevet Yisrael. That a Shevet Yisrael, that they violated an Isur Chatos, meaning an Isur Shkoga B'Kares, Isur Kares B'Shkoga, I should say it that way, then each Shevet will bring its own Korban Chatos, which we call a Chatos Pnimis, and that's a result of Horas Bezdin B'Tolos. That's called a Halim, Par Halim Dovashal Tzibur. Now we get up to Chatos HaOf. Chatos HaOf is a real complicated sugya in Kodshim. But we're only touching, on a very surface level. A Zav, after his Tefillah, on the 8th day, he brings an Of L'Chatos. And Chatos HaOf is different than Chatos Behemah. יש בחטס העוף מה שאין בחטס בהמה שהיא באה על הסופק. חטס העוף הבא על הסופק כיצד? והם מסובק עם זב הוא עם לאו, מביא עוף לחטסו מסופק. חטזו אין נחלס אלא נשרפס מסופק, שמא אינו מחויב קורבן. So we have a person that doesn't know whether he's a Zav or he's not a Zav. He brings an Of L'Chatos Misofek. And if I understand it correctly, he makes a T'nai. He says that if in fact I'm a Zav, let this be my Chatos Of as a Zav. If I'm not a Zav, then let it be a Korban Adav. Right? Do we discuss? We didn't discuss. a little confused. We're talking about chatas, and there's no nedava on chatas, correct? So when he brings the chatas off, why isn't that a violation of Kodshim, of Chule Bazara? So if I understand this correctly, there's a new parsha in the Torah, which, I mean, it's similar, it reminds me of Noshim Tolu, meaning that there's a carbon that's brought besafek. And it could very well be that you're not chayav in that carbon, but yet it's not chulul azor because the Torah says the suffix itself generates the carbon. That's called chatas ha'ofa, bala suffix. Because again, he cannot use a tanai and say, well, either it's a chova or it's an adov. There is no such thing as a chatas in adov. And then he writes, chatas zu eina necheles ela nisrefes misafek. Okay, nisrefes misafek, but you did everything else. You brought it into the Azara, you did the 4 avodas. That's a gather, it's a definition, a category unto itself called chata sofa bola sofa. Now we get to the third category, which is called the asham, and that's kodshim. And once again, like the case of chatos, the emurim are burnt on the mizbeach, and the basar is nechal zichrei kahuna. Asham is like chatos; it doesn't count b'nedava or b'neder. There's only a chovas kapara. And there are 5 situations in which he's chayv of carbon asham. And there's no such thing as an asham as a carbon tzibur. It's only a yachid. So again, it doesn't have an addendum double. It only comes b'chov. It doesn't come for a tzibur. It only comes for a yachid. In that sense, I would say that asham is the most limited. If Olo is the most expansive, then I would say on the other end of the podium of the circle here is the other extreme would be asham. It's very rare. It's not b'nedava. It's only b'chov. Now he doesn't write the 5 cases for which you chayav carbon asham. So ba b'chovas hayochid keitzad mal b'kodshei Hashem ishtamish ben v'nen mehem b'shava pruta maybe asham me'ilos. All right, he only gives you one example. Now, what's unique about carbon asham? A carbon asham has what's called an asham tolui. Again, we saw something similar in the case of chatas ha'of. But chatas behema, for example, because now we're talking about behema, then chas v'shalom to bring it b'safek unless it would lend itself to a nadav, but there's no nadav by a chatas. And yet the Torah has an entire parsha called the Asham Tolui. He doesn't know, did he eat chalev, did he eat shuman, is he chayav a carbon chatas, is he not chayav a carbon chatas, he has to bring a carbon Asham Tolui. And the nature of that carbon is it's a carbon v'toras bada. Again, the machayav of the carbon is a suffix, but the carbon is a chova. Otherwise, it's the suffix chul azor. And if I'm not mistaken, this carbon Asham Tolui parallels the case of chatas ha'ofa balash suffix. And in both cases, we're going to have to say that the chov is a chovas vada. It's bala suffix, but it's a chovas vada. He doesn't discuss what happens after he brought the Yashim Tolui if he finds out later that he ate chelev. And in such a case, he's going to have to bring a korban chatas. I didn't see that he mentioned it here. And finally, the last category is that of a shlomim. The shlomim is kodshim kalim, which means that besides burning the imurim on the mizbech, the rest of the basar is eaten by either zichrei kahuna or by the bailim themselves. And the only entity called shalmei tzibur is kivsei atzeret. And it's odd because shlomim and kodshim kalim, but kivsei atzeres have the status of kodshim. Now, what's the status of the basar of kivsei atzeres? The emurim are burnt on the mizbeach. The basar is eaten by kohanim, not like a korban shlomim, where the bailim eat the basar. But here in kivsei atzeres, insofar as it's kodshim, it's besaram nechal l'kon. And te'unim nisachim. Okay, there's more here about shlomim, but I think we'll try to pick that up tomorrow. Let me see. So we're here on the bottom of page Gimel, just to finish up on shlomim. Okay then?